My husband handed me divorce papers. Signed them. I found the love of my life. I signed without a word. A week later, he married his perfect dream woman. Then I saw her face. I couldn't stop laughing because he didn't even sit down first. That's the part I keep coming back to. 11 years of marriage and he delivered the end of it standing up, like he had somewhere better to be, like he'd rehearsed it in the car and wanted to get it over with before he lost his nerve. We'd been married since I was 26, long enough that I stopped noticing the small things sliding away one at a time. Date nights that quietly became grocery runs, the way he started taking calls in the garage instead of the kitchen, the fact that for the last year or so, he'd stopped introducing me as his wife at parties and just started saying, "This is my wife," like a formality he was reciting rather than a fact he was proud of. I told myself every marriage goes through seasons. I told myself a lot of things, actually, and most of them were lies I needed in order to keep getting up in the morning. Looking back, the first crack was so small I almost laughed when I finally remembered it. About 18 months before the papers landed on the counter, he started going to the gym at 6 in the morning instead of after work. He said it was for his knees. He said a lot of things were for his knees that year. My best friend used to tell me I was too patient with him, not my sister by blood, my closest friend since I was 19 years old, the one who'd stood up in a bridesmaid dress the color of a sunset at my wedding, the one who called herself my sister so often and so naturally that half our extended family had genuinely forgotten she wasn't. She used to sit across from me at brunch on Sunday mornings and say, half joking, that if a man ever treated her the way he sometimes treated me, she'd have been gone years earlier. I used to laugh and tell her marriage was more complicated than she understood, that she'd get it once she found someone of her own. Looking back, I think she understood it a great deal better than I did. I just didn't understand what exactly she understood. Her name was Renata, and she'd moved to our city the same year I met my husband, both of us fresh out of college and terrified of the same things. We built our whole adult lives running parallel to each other. She was there when I got engaged, screaming into a pillow in my childhood bedroom before either of us had told our parents. She was there at 3 in the morning when I miscarried our first pregnancy, sitting on the bathroom floor with me because my husband had a work trip he said he couldn't move. She was there for every anniversary, every holiday, every ordinary Tuesday phone call that turned into 2 hours because neither of us had anything better to do. I trusted her with things I'd never told another living soul. I trusted her, full stop, the way you trust gravity, without examining it, because examining it had simply never occurred to me. That's what made the last 18 months of my marriage so strange in hindsight, because Renata started pulling away right around the same time those early morning gym trips began. She had reasons, always reasonable ones, a new job with unpredictable hours, a dating app situation she didn't want to jinx by talking about too soon, a family thing back home she wasn't ready to explain. I believed every one of them, because why on earth wouldn't I? I didn't put it together, not for a long time, not until it was far, far too late to matter. The night the papers appeared, I'd made pasta. That's another detail I can't seem to let go of. I'd made pasta, the good kind with the sauce that takes 3 hours because it was a Tuesday, and I'd had an unusually good day at work and wanted to celebrate something, even if the something was nothing more than getting through a Tuesday without incident. He came in through the side door by the garage rather than the front, which should have told me something on its own. He set his bag down on the counter, next to the pot of sauce still simmering, and pulled out a manila folder thick enough that I knew before he said a word that this wasn't a conversation. This was a delivery. "Sign them," he said, sliding the folder across the counter like it was a lease renewal I'd forgotten to handle. "I found the love of my life. You'll understand once you meet her. She's everything you're not." I want to say I had some devastating response ready. I didn't. I stood there with a wooden spoon still in my hand, sauce dripping slowly onto the tile, and felt something in my chest go very quiet, the way a room goes quiet right before a storm hits, when the birds stop and the air changes pressure. "Who is she?" I said. It wasn't really a question. I didn't actually want the answer yet. "That doesn't matter right now," he said, which of course meant it mattered enormously, just not to him, not in that moment, not in a way he was willing to give me. "What matters is that I've been unhappy for a long time, and I finally have the courage to do something about it." The courage. He used that word like he was the one taking the risk here, like signing divorce papers on a woman who'd built her entire adult life around him required some kind of bravery I should admire him for. I didn't ask who she was. I didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't even ask when this had started, because some part of me had already made peace with the marriage being over long before he ever said the words out loud, sometime around those early gym mornings and the private phone calls, sometime in that long, slow slide I'd spent so long refusing to name. I picked up the pen he'd conveniently left resting on top of the folder, signed on every line he'd flagged with a yellow sticky note, and slid it back to him across the counter, right past the pot of sauce that would end up burned because neither of us thought to turn off the stove. "That's it?" he asked, and for half a second, just half a second, he looked almost disappointed that I wasn't going to fight for him, that I wasn't going to beg or rage or give him the dramatic scene he'd apparently steeled himself for on the drive home. "That's it," I said. He moved out within the week. I found out later from a neighbor who mentioned it in passing months afterward that he'd already had an apartment lined up for over a month before he ever slid that folder across the counter. He hadn't come home that night to have a conversation. He'd come home to execute a plan that was already finished, and I had simply been the last item left on his checklist. The first person I called that night after he left and the sauce had gone from simmering to scorched and I finally remembered the burner was still on was Renata. Of course it was. 11 years of marriage ending in a single conversation, and my instinct wasn't to call my mother or my actual sister 3 states away. It was to call the woman who'd been my sister in every way that counted since I was 19. She didn't pick up. I told myself myself she was probably asleep or at work or in the middle of one of those unpredictable shifts she'd mentioned. I texted her instead, something short, something that didn't fully capture the size of what had just happened because I didn't yet have words for it myself. He just handed me divorce papers. I think I'm in shock. She texted back almost an hour later. Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm slammed at work right now, but I'll call you tomorrow, I promise. Are you okay? I told her I was fine because that's what you say, even when it's the furthest thing from true. I sat alone in my kitchen that night with a burned pot of pasta sauce and a signed divorce agreement and no one to talk to about either one. And I told myself it was a fluke, a bad timing coincidence, the kind of thing that happens sometimes between two people who love each other. She didn't call the next day or the day after that. When she finally did call, 4 days later, she spent most of the conversation talking about her own week, a work deadline, a bad date, a minor car repair that had eaten into her savings, before circling back, almost as an afterthought, to ask how I was holding up. I chalked it up to her being overwhelmed. People get overwhelmed. People have their own lives, their own crises, their own bad weeks that happen to collide with yours at the worst possible moment. I told myself this so many times over those first few weeks that I started to believe it was simply true, rather than a story I was telling myself to avoid a more uncomfortable one. My actual sister flew in for a few days to help me pack up some of his remaining things and go through the house, room by room, deciding what stayed and what would eventually need to be split or sold. She was the one who sat with me on the bathroom floor at 2 in the morning when the grief finally caught up to the shock and came crashing down all at once. She was the one who made me eat actual meals instead of standing over the sink with a spoon and a jar of peanut butter, calling it dinner because it technically involved food. Renata sent a card, a nice one, expensive cardstock, a handwritten note about how strong I was and how she was thinking of me constantly. She did not, in the 6 weeks between the papers landing on my counter and the day the wedding photos hit my feed, come to see me a single time. I didn't notice how strange that was. Not really. Grief has a way of making you generous with the people you love, willing to excuse almost anything as long as you believe their intentions are good. I believed hers were good. I had 11 years of evidence that they always had been. I had no idea, crying in the bathroom with my actual sister in the middle of the night, that the reason Renata hadn't come to see me had nothing to do with being busy, overwhelmed, or bad at showing up during hard times. It had everything to do with the fact that she couldn't look me in the eye. 7 days after the papers were finalized, my phone would not stop buzzing. Texts from my cousin, texts from an old coworker I hadn't spoken to in over a year, a voice memo from my aunt that I didn't even open because I could already tell from the preview that whatever it contained wasn't going to be good. When I finally sat down at my kitchen table and looked at what everyone was reacting to, my stomach dropped somewhere down near my knees. He'd gotten married already. A full wedding, not a courthouse thing, not a quiet elopement he might have had the decency to keep private. A venue with a rooftop view, white roses arranged in tall glass vases everywhere, a string quartet visible in the corner of every single photo like they'd hired the same photographer who'd shot his and my wedding years earlier, if only to prove some kind of point. His mother was in the front row in nearly every shot, crying the kind of tears you cry when you've been hoping for something for a very long time, the kind of joy that doesn't happen spontaneously in 7 days. That detail alone should have told me everything. A mother doesn't cry like that at a wedding she found out about a week ago. A mother cries like that at a wedding she's been waiting years to attend. The caption under the main photo read, "Finally found a real woman who deserves me." There were 40-some photos in the album, and I sat on my kitchen floor going through every single one of them, telling myself I'd stop after the next, and then the next. The way you keep pressing on a bruise just to confirm to yourself that it still hurts, that you're not imagining the pain, that this is really happening to you and not to some character in a story you're reading. Everyone in the comments was calling the bride stunning, elegant, a perfect match for him, whatever that meant. Comment after comment piling up from people who'd known me for years, and clearly had absolutely no idea whose wedding they were praising. No idea that the woman in the photos had once held my hand through a miscarriage on a bathroom floor. I scrolled through professional shots of the two of them laughing at some private joke, her hand pressed flat against his chest like she owned it, like she'd earned the right to stand there long before this photographer ever showed up with his expensive lenses and his golden hour timing. Then I got to the close-up, the one where she's looking directly at the camera, veil pushed back, makeup done by someone who clearly charged by the hour rather than by the job. I zoomed in, expecting to feel the specific kind of nothing I'd been practicing for a solid week, a numbness I'd been cultivating on purpose because it was easier than the alternative. Instead, the air left my lungs in one long breath, like someone had reached into my chest and pulled it out through my ribs. I knew that jaw. I knew the small pale scar just above her left eyebrow, the one she got falling off a porch swing when we were both 15 years old and she dared me to push her higher than either of us was comfortable with. I knew that face better than I knew my own some years, because for over a decade she had been the person I called first, not last, the person whose number I dialed before I even fully processed whatever news I was calling to share. My sister. Not by blood, but by every single holiday dinner since we were both barely out of our teens, every 2 a.m. phone call when either of our lives fell apart, every promise she'd made me over cheap wine and expensive takeout that she would always have my back no matter what happened between us. I didn't cry. I laughed. I laughed so hard and so suddenly that I nearly knocked over the glass of water on the table beside me, because how exactly do you explain to yourself that your ex-husband just married the one person on this entire earth who swore she'd never let anything come between the two of you? The laughter didn't last long. It burned off fast, the way way a shock always does. And underneath it was something much colder and much more useful. Something that felt less like grief and more like clarity finally arriving after weeks of deliberately not looking at what was right in front of me. I opened my messages with Renata. 4 years of them, actually, going back much further than I wanted to admit I'd ever noticed. I hadn't gone looking for evidence before that day. Some part of me hadn't wanted to find anything, because finding something would mean admitting I'd been living inside a lie for longer than a single Tuesday evening. But once I started scrolling backward, the pattern revealed itself with a speed that made me feel almost stupid for not seeing it sooner. There were messages asking if he was working late again on the exact nights he'd told me he had a client dinner. There were messages where she said she felt sick lying to my face over dinner, sick enough that she'd apparently considered telling me more than once and then talked herself out of it. There were messages discussing hotel room numbers, disguised so casually as work conference details that I'd have needed to already suspect something to catch it. There were messages about anniversary gifts he'd bought for her that year, the same year he'd forgotten mine entirely and blamed it on being swamped at work. I sat with those screenshots for nearly 2 hours before I did anything at all. Not because I was hesitating about whether to expose them. That decision had made itself somewhere around message 400, but because I wanted to be precise about it. I didn't want a messy, emotional confrontation that people could later dismiss as an unstable ex-wife lashing out. I wanted something undeniable. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't need one for what I had in mind. I opened the extended family group chat that still, somehow, had both of them in it. The one his mother had built years earlier for coordinating holidays and birthdays. The one nobody had ever bothered removing anyone from, because who removes a family member from a group chat over an ordinary divorce? I posted 6 screenshots. No caption. I didn't need one. His mother called me within 11 minutes. Her voice shaking so hard I could hear it rattling through the phone speaker before she even said a full sentence. "Is this real?" she asked. "Tell me this isn't real. Ask her yourself," I said. "I'm sure she has an explanation ready." By the next morning, the group chat had exploded into a thread I was no longer part of, because he'd removed me the second he realized what had happened, apparently under the mistaken impression that removing me from a conversation could somehow undo the fact that everyone in it had already read every single message. His best man, the same one who'd given a toast at both weddings, texted me directly to say he'd known for over a year and hadn't known what to do with that information, that he'd told himself it wasn't his business to interfere in someone else's marriage. I didn't respond to that one. Some apologies aren't really for the person receiving them. They're for the person offering them, a way of setting down a weight they've been carrying and calling it accountability. The marriage, as it turned out, lasted exactly 19 days before Renata quietly moved out of the apartment they'd been sharing since before the wedding, and by then half his family had already stopped speaking to him, not for divorcing me, but for what he'd apparently done to get there, and what he'd let his mother believe about how long this had actually been going on. I thought that was the end of it. I really did. I thought I'd found the whole truth, exposed it, watched the consequences land exactly where they belonged, and that I could finally start putting my life back together with a clear picture of exactly what had happened to me. I was wrong. I had found an affair. I had not yet found the reason for it. For a few months, I let myself believe the story was finished. Betrayed wife discovers affair, exposes it publicly, watches the marriage collapse under its own weight, moves on with her dignity intact. It's a clean story. It's the kind of story people tell at dinner parties years later, shaking their heads, saying, "Can you believe it?" and everyone nodding along because, yes, actually, they can believe it, because these things happen all the time. I threw myself into work. I'd taken a step back from my career years earlier, not entirely by choice, to support the shape his job required our household to take. The relocations, the client dinners I hosted, the version of a life that centered around his advancement rather than mine. Now, with nothing left to protect, I went back to it with something close to hunger. I picked up a consulting role I'd been offered twice before and turned down twice before, and I said yes without hesitating a second time. My actual sister flew back out for a long weekend about 2 months after the wedding photos, and we spent most of it doing ordinary things: grocery shopping, a hike, a long overdue closet purge where we filled 6 garbage bags with clothes I associated with a life I no longer had. It was during that closet purge that she asked, almost offhand, whether I'd heard anything from Renata since the group chat blew up. I told her no, nothing. Complete silence, which honestly felt appropriate given the circumstances. "That's weird though, right?" my sister said, holding up a sweater and deciding against it. "You two were basically attached at the hip for over a decade, and now nothing. Not even a single message trying to explain herself or beg forgiveness or anything." I hadn't really thought about it that way. I'd assumed the silence was shame, the natural quiet of someone who knows they did something unforgivable and doesn't have the nerve to face the person they wronged. But my sister's question sat with me longer than I expected it to, the way certain offhand comments do, working their way slowly under your skin over the following days. Because Renata wasn't a person who went quiet. In 11 years of knowing her, I couldn't think of a single conflict, however minor, where she hadn't tried to talk her way through it, to explain, to soften, to be understood even when she was clearly in the wrong. She was, if anything, compulsively communicative. The version of her who'd simply vanished into silence after the affair came out didn't match the version of her I'd spent a decade actually knowing. I told myself people change under pressure. I told myself public humiliation does strange things to a person's instincts. I told myself this, and mostly I believed it, for another several weeks, until a coincidence dropped a thread directly into my lap that I couldn't quite ignore. The thread came from the most unremarkable place imaginable, a mutual acquaintance's cluttered online marketplace listing. I'd been searching for a secondhand dining table, the kind of ordinary errand that fills an ordinary Saturday, and stumbled across a listing posted by someone I vaguely recognized from Renata's old friend group, a woman named Priya, who'd been at a handful of the same birthday parties over the years without ever becoming someone I knew well. Priya's profile had a comment thread underneath an unrelated post, congratulating her on a new job, and buried in the replies was an offhand line from another old mutual friend. Guess Renata's the only one of us who actually landed on her feet after everything with the wedding. Must be nice to have family money to fall back into. Family money. I sat there staring at that phrase for a long time. Renata didn't have family money. Renata had grown up by her own account, in circumstances not unlike mine, comfortable but unremarkable, a childhood defined by careful budgeting rather than trust funds. It was one of the things we'd bonded over originally, actually, both of us building our adult lives from nothing rather than inheriting a running start. I messaged the woman who'd left the comment, someone named Deb I'd met exactly twice, both times at Renata's birthday gatherings years apart. I kept it light, framed it as harmless curiosity, said something about running into an old mutual and wondering how everyone from that circle was doing these days. Deb responded almost immediately, apparently unaware or unconcerned that I was the wife in the story everyone had clearly been discussing behind closed doors. "Oh, you probably know more than me, honestly," she wrote. "Wasn't it your husband's money that set her up? I heard she got a huge settlement out of the whole thing, way more than she should have for a 19-day marriage. My cousin does contract work at the firm that handled it. Small world, LOL. I read that message 4 times before it fully landed. A settlement. 19 days of marriage. And Renata had walked away with something substantial enough for near strangers to be discussing it as common knowledge months later, in an unrelated comment thread about someone else's job. I didn't know the terms of Renata's marriage or her divorce. I hadn't asked, hadn't wanted to know, had told myself the details of their 19 days together were none of my business anymore. But a settlement implied negotiation. A settlement implied lawyers, and terms, and something being fought over and divided, which meant there was something worth fighting over in the first place. I thought exposing the affair in that group chat had settled the whole matter months earlier. One betrayal fully accounted for and appropriately punished, a story that had already resolved itself before I ever went looking for anything more. I had no idea, sitting at my kitchen table with a stranger's careless comment glowing on my phone screen, that I had only just found the beginning of it. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I pulled up the public court records portal for our county, the same one I'd used during my own divorce proceedings, and searched for Renata's name alongside her married surname. The case existed, filed and finalized with unusual speed, faster even than mine had been, despite the fact that a marriage involving genuinely disputed assets should have taken considerably longer to resolve than a marriage lasting 19 days. I could see the filing dates and the fact that it had been settled rather than litigated. I could not see the actual settlement terms, which were sealed, a detail that struck me as strange enough on its own. Someone had specifically requested that seal, and someone had specifically agreed to it. I called the courthouse, more out of frustration than any real expectation of getting somewhere, and spoke to a clerk who explained in general terms what typically prompts a settlement to be sealed. Business interests sometimes. Non-disclosure requirements tied to an amount someone doesn't want made public. Business interests. That phrase snagged on something in the back of my mind and refused to let go, because my ex-husband didn't have business interests of his own. Not really. He was an employee at his firm, not an owner, not someone with equity that would need protecting through a sealed settlement. Unless something had changed since our divorce that I simply hadn't been paying attention to, because why would I have been? I spent the following weekend searching business registries, news archives, anything that might explain how a 19-day marriage generated a settlement substantial enough for a stranger to be gossiping about it months later. What I found, buried in a local business journal's brief announcement section from a few months before our divorce, sent an entirely new wave of shock through me, not from betrayal this time, but from the sudden dizzying sense that I understood almost none of what had actually happened to me. The announcement was short, the kind of item most people would scroll past without a second thought. A brief note about a minority equity stake being restructured at the firm he worked for, naming him alongside 2 other employees as new partial stakeholders in a spin-off division the company had recently created, 4 months before our divorce. Long before I had any reason to suspect our marriage was ending, he had quietly become a business owner, however small his stake, in a way he had never once mentioned to me, not over dinner, not during any of the countless ordinary conversations 2 people have about their days. I sat with that for a long time, trying to make sense of why a person would hide something like that from their spouse. An equity stake isn't shameful. It's the kind of thing you'd normally celebrate, mention casually, use as leverage in a conversation about your own career trajectory, unless you had a specific reason to want your spouse to remain unaware of it, at least for a while. I thought about the timeline. That equity stake had appeared months before he ever slid divorce papers across the counter. Roughly 2 months after that came the early gym trips, the calls in the garage, the slow drift I'd spent so long explaining away. A few months after that, he handed me a folder across the kitchen counter and told me he'd found the love of his life. And within weeks of our divorce being finalized, he married a woman with a sealed settlement from her own 19-day marriage. A woman who, by all accounts from near strangers discussing it in a comment thread, had come out of that marriage with money attached to it that shouldn't have made sense for such a short union. I kept turning the pieces over, trying different arrangements, the way you turn a jigsaw piece in your hand, looking for the edge that will finally let it click into place. Nothing quite fit until I made myself ask a question I'd been avoiding since Deb's message message first landed in my inbox. What if the affair itself hadn't been the point? What if the affair had simply been the fastest way to end a marriage that needed ending? Not for reasons of love at all, but for whatever my leaving would allow to happen next. I didn't have proof of anything yet. I had a timeline that troubled me, a sealed settlement that troubled me, and a version of my ex-husband's financial life that I was only now realizing I had never fully understood because he had specifically arranged for me not to. I called my divorce attorney the next morning, the same woman who'd handled my case with brisk professionalism and very little hand-holding, and asked her a question I hadn't thought to ask during our own proceedings: whether an equity stake acquired before a divorce filing but never disclosed during that filing would have been something I was legally entitled to know about. Her answer changed the entire shape of what I thought I was dealing with. If he acquired that stake before your filing date and didn't disclose it, my attorney said, her voice taking on the particular careful tone lawyers use when they're about to tell you something that's going to complicate your life considerably, that's potentially a significant problem. Financial disclosures during divorce proceedings aren't optional. If an asset existed and he knew about it, it should have been on the record, regardless of how small the stake was at the time. I asked her what that would mean, practically speaking, for a divorce that had already been finalized months earlier. It depends on what we can actually prove, she said, but if there's a documented pattern of concealment, courts can and sometimes do reopen settlements, particularly if the concealed asset was significant, or if it can be shown he restructured his finances specifically to keep something out of the marital estate before the divorce filing. I hung up and sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot for nearly 20 minutes, running through every financial conversation we'd had in that final year of our marriage. The mortgage refinance he'd suggested, which I'd agreed to without much scrutiny. The rainy day fund savings account, separate from our joint accounts, which had struck me as slightly odd at the time but not odd enough to question. The credit card he'd taken out in his name only for work expense reimbursement purposes 6 months before the divorce. None of these things had seemed significant in isolation. Together, laid out on a timeline, they looked like exactly what my attorney had described: a pattern. A person quietly restructuring his financial life piece by piece in the months before ending a marriage, specifically so that whatever he was building wouldn't have to be shared. A theory started forming that I didn't want to believe, because believing it meant admitting that the woman I'd trusted for over a decade hadn't simply betrayed me with an affair. It meant something considerably colder than that. It meant a plan. I needed more than a theory. I needed to actually see the numbers, and there was only one place I could think of where those numbers might still exist in a form I could access. We'd used a shared budgeting app for most of our marriage, one of those subscription services that syncs across linked bank accounts and generates tidy little charts about where your money goes each month. I'd stopped checking it entirely after the divorce, assuming he'd removed my access the same week he moved his things out, the way most people sever those digital connections almost immediately once a marriage ends. He hadn't. Whether through oversight, arrogance, or simple carelessness about a detail he assumed no longer mattered, my login still worked when I tried it on a whim that same evening, months after our divorce had been finalized. The account had been quietly modified, several of the linked accounts removed, new ones I didn't recognize added in their place, but the historical data from our marriage was still sitting there, untouched, a full record of exactly where our money had gone during that final year together. I spent an entire weekend going through it line by line, cross-referencing dates against the timeline I'd already built in my head. The rainy day savings account had received regular transfers starting almost exactly when the equity restructuring announcement had run in that business journal. Small amounts at first, easy to overlook, then larger ones as the months went on. The work expense credit card had accumulated charges that, on closer inspection, didn't look like client dinners or business travel at all. Hotel charges in a city I knew Renata's extended family lived in. A jewelry purchase 2 months before our divorce that I had certainly never received. And then I found the transfer that made the entire theory click into place, with a finality that left me sitting on my kitchen floor for the second time in this whole ordeal. Though this time, there was no laughter in it at all. A single transfer, made from his newly restructured personal account 4 days after our divorce was finalized, to an account belonging to Renata. Not a gift between new partners setting up a life together. A specific, documented amount that matched almost exactly, down to a few $100s, the total figure of the equity stake he'd acquired months earlier and never disclosed during our proceedings. He hadn't just hidden an asset from me, he'd hidden it, grown it, and then moved it directly to Renata the moment our divorce was legally final, structured in a way that looked, on paper, less like a wedding gift between newlyweds and more like a payment for services rendered. I didn't know yet what those services had actually been. I had a theory forming, one that made my hands shake as I typed out the numbers into a document of my own, but I still didn't have the full picture, didn't understand yet exactly what Renata had done to earn a transfer that size, or how long she'd been planning to earn it. I needed to talk to someone who'd actually know. There was exactly one person left who might. I still had his best man's number from the text he'd sent months earlier, the one apologizing for having known about the affair and staying quiet about it. I hadn't responded to that message at the time, hadn't seen any point in accepting an apology that felt more like an attempt to unburden his own conscience than an actual act of accountability. But I still had the number, and I needed it now. I texted him a single line: "I think there's more to this than an affair, and I think you might know something about it." He called me within the hour, which told me quite a bit on its own about how much this had apparently been weighing on him. "I don't know everything," he said, once we'd gotten past the awkwardness of speaking directly for the first time since our lives had become tangled up in this mess. "But I know he was under a lot of pressure that year. Financial pressure. her. He never told me exactly why, but he mentioned once, a while back before any of this happened, that he was worried about a lawsuit tied to the new equity structure at his firm. Something about the spin-off division not performing the way it was projected to, and some of the original investors threatening legal action over how the restructuring had been handled. I asked him if he knew anything about how Renata fit into that picture. There was a long pause before he answered, the particular kind of pause that tells you the person on the other end is deciding how much to actually say. I always thought it was strange, he said finally, that she showed up in his life just as all that pressure started building. I met her a couple of times before the wedding, and something about her felt, I don't know, rehearsed, almost. Like she already knew things about his situation she shouldn't have known yet, given how new the relationship supposedly was. I brought it up to him once, just as a joke, said something like, does your new girlfriend moonlight as a forensic accountant or something, because she'd made some offhand comment about his equity stake that seemed way too specific for someone who'd supposedly just met him. He didn't remember the exact comment, but he remembered the feeling it had left him with, a low hum of wrongness he'd talked himself out of taking seriously because, in his words, it wasn't his marriage and it wasn't his business. I thanked him, hung up, and sat with what he'd told me for a long time. Renata knew things about my ex-husband's financial situation before the relationship, by all appearances should have given her the opportunity to know them. That detail alone reframed everything. It meant the affair hadn't started organically out of some slow-building attraction between two people who happened to cross paths. It meant she'd known about the equity stake and the pressure surrounding it before she ever became involved with him at all, which meant, if I was reading this correctly, that Renata hadn't simply seduced my husband away from our marriage. She'd been sent. Sent by whom, though? That was the question that kept me up for the next several nights, turning over every possibility I could think of and discarding most of them almost as quickly as they arrived. A rival business partner looking to sabotage the equity restructuring didn't quite fit. Why go through the elaborate trouble of embedding someone in his personal life rather than simply pursuing the lawsuit the best man had mentioned? A jealous former colleague felt equally implausible. Too personal a scheme for something that ultimately looked like it was about money rather than revenge. I went back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the affair, but the actual beginning. The year Renata and I met. Fresh out of college, both of us new to the city, and looking for anyone who felt like home. I'd always assumed our friendship had been a happy accident. Two lonely 22-year-olds finding each other at a mutual friend's housewarming party and simply clicking the way people sometimes do. I started digging into that mutual friend, a woman named Carla I'd lost touch with over a decade earlier. Someone I hadn't thought about in years, because our friendship had simply faded the ordinary way friendships do when people's lives grow in different directions. I found her fairly easily online, sent a message explaining, in general terms, that I was trying to piece together some old history, and had a few questions about how she and Renata had originally known each other. Carla's response took 2 days to arrive, and when it did, it wasn't the answer I expected. Oh, she wrote, we didn't actually know each other before that party. She reached out to me a few weeks before, said a mutual acquaintance had mentioned I was throwing a housewarming, and asked if she could tag along since she was new in town and didn't know anyone. I figured it was normal, small city, small world stuff. Why? Is everything okay? A mutual acquaintance. I asked Carla if she remembered who that acquaintance had been. She didn't, not off the top of her head, but she said she'd dig through old messages if it mattered to me, and a day later she sent me a screenshot of a conversation from over a decade earlier, faded and slightly cropped from whatever platform they'd originally used, but still legible enough to make out the name of the person who'd asked Carla to let Renata tag along to that party where we'd first met. I stared at that name, unable to process it at first. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't some business associate of my ex-husband's, some distant connection I'd never have reason to know. It was my own father-in-law, the same man who, at every holiday dinner for 11 years, had sat across the table from me asking about my career, my family, my life, all while apparently having orchestrated the person I'd trust most in this world into my life over a decade before any of it would matter. It took me almost a week to work up the nerve to actually confront him, and when I finally did, I didn't do it over the phone. I drove to the house where he'd hosted every holiday dinner for over a decade, sat across from him at the same kitchen table where he'd once toasted my wedding, and told him exactly what I'd found. He didn't look surprised. He looked, if anything, faintly relieved, the particular expression of someone who's been waiting a long time to stop carrying a secret alone. The truth came out slowly. He'd loaned his son money early in his career, never formally documented, and watched it grow inside assets that were technically his son's alone. If the marriage ever ended, half of it, including money that had originally been his, could end up divided in a settlement he'd have no say over. So over a decade ago, before I'd even met his son, he'd started building insurance. He'd found Renata through a distant business connection, funded her relocation, arranged her introduction to Carla, and, through Carla, to me. Not for any specific plan yet, just someone embedded close to the family, in case the marriage ever became a liability. For years, that meant nothing. Renata was simply my friend, living her life exactly the way anyone would. It was only when the equity lawsuit began threatening real exposure that the arrangement he'd built a decade earlier finally became useful. A clean, fast divorce. A fast remarriage to someone who already understood the situation and could help quietly move the hidden equities somewhere the lawsuit couldn't reach. Renata hadn't fallen in love with my husband over 18 months of secret meetings. She had been waiting for a call for 11 years. I didn't say anything for a long moment after he finished. He sat across from me at that kitchen table, hands folded the way they always were at every holiday dinner I could remember, waiting for some kind of absolution I had absolutely no intention of giving him. You You understand, he said finally, when the silence had stretched long enough to make even him uncomfortable, that none of this was personal. You were a lovely addition to this family for 11 years. This was never about you specifically. That sentence landed harder than almost anything else I'd heard in the entire ordeal. 11 years of holiday dinners, of him asking about my job and my parents and my life like he actually cared about the answers. And the entire time, I had simply been a variable in a financial hedge he'd constructed before we'd ever met, not a person. A risk to be managed patiently over more than a decade, with the same careful attention he apparently gave every other asset in his life. I asked him if his son knew, whether the man I'd married, the man who'd stood across from me in our own kitchen and slid a folder toward me like a lease renewal, had known any of this, had known that the woman he was falling for had been placed there specifically to catch him. No, he said, and for the first time in the conversation, something that looked almost like shame crossed his face. He genuinely believes he fell in love. I've let him believe that. It was kinder, as if kindness had ever been the operating principle behind any of this, as if a decade of quietly funding a stranger's friendships and relocations and eventual marriage could be filed under the same heading as bringing someone soup when they're sick. I stood up from that table without another word, walked out through the same front door I'd walked through for 11 years of holidays, and sat behind the wheel in his driveway for several minutes before I trusted myself to drive. I thought about calling my actual sister, the one who'd sat with me on the bathroom floor at 2 in the morning, the one who'd never once needed to be planted in my life by anyone because she simply loved me the ordinary, unremarkable way family sometimes does without an agenda attached. I thought about calling my attorney, about the equity stake, about whether any of this could still be unwound in a courtroom months after the fact. I didn't call anyone yet. I just sat there in the driveway of the house where I'd been welcomed, apparently, as a manageable risk rather than a daughter-in-law, watching the porch light flicker on as the sun went down, and let myself finally understand the full shape of the 11 years I'd just spent believing I knew exactly who loved me.